Indeed, as the situation in Cuba unfolds, attention turns to the upcoming US presidential election and its potential implications for Cuban-American relations. Both major parties have historically taken different approaches to Cuba, with Republicans favouring a hardline stance and Democrats advocating for engagement and diplomacy.
The Biden administration has been critiqued by the Cuban exile community and those who are actually trying to find more ways for things to get even more difficult for the regime and to tighten sanctions and to apply more sanctions. And so the Biden administration has been somewhat responsive after July 11th, 2021, but we have heard that they have been engaging in some talks about doing more with the Cuban regime as far as addressing the needs of the Cuban people. And so a lot of Cubans who tend to be Republican on this issue, Cuban Americans in exile, tend to be people who vote more conservatively because they grew up in a communist regime. And so this one issue tends to push them over, although they tend to be pretty liberal when it comes to issues domestically, but when it comes to foreign policy, it's tough because when Trump was in office, he tightened, policy on Cuba, and, the Democrats and some people in Congress want to push Biden into, softening the Trump policies. But what I've heard is that, and what I've seen is that Biden has tried to remain neutral, but the Cuban exile community and the Cuban people with their protests have actually pushed him to not necessarily do more against the Trump administration policies. He's actually kept, Cuba on the terrorist list. The Cuban regime is still on the terrorist list, which is really important. But as far as remissions to Cuba, I know that the Biden administration is allowing up to $1,000, where before that wasn't the case, but they want to push Western Union. And the Cuban exile community, we do not want that. Actually, Cuban exiles are not sending money to Cuba. I'm not even sending money to my own family in Cuba because I know that the regime is going to get a percentage. And we don't want to fuel the regime in any way whatsoever. We want this regime to fall. So as far as who's going to represent more of the Cuban people's needs, it may seem like the Republican or Republican candidate, but in reality, we don't know if it's going to align largely with the political needs and the policy needs of an entire Cuban community that's multi-generational, that's also a bit liberal. But when it comes to Cuba policy, typically the Republicans are the ones that do a better job.
Well, they're probably a bit worried about Trump coming back because he's the one that imposed the sanctions on the grounds of terrorism. But the point is, though, that Biden didn't lift them. So they're in for a tough time either way. Perhaps Trump will be more outrageously anti-Cuba, but Biden won't be that much different. So the election's not really good for them. It may be if Biden gets back in, they try and do a deal to do some economic and political reforms at home in exchange for lifting the embargo, but it'd be a pretty brave bargain to make. And no one will do it before the election because, of course, the exiled Cubans are pretty important in Florida and Texas and in important states. So it's probably something for the president after the election, not before. Well, the sanctions made it very hard to invest in Cuba, so that held things up. The tourism industry got completely smashed by COVID. I mean, 4 million tourists suddenly gone. So that meant no tourists, no foreign exchange. Plus the people who want to invest in, Cuban tourism, back to the sort of heyday of you saw in the Godfather movies, how big casinos were in Cuba. That's dried up, and it's meant, their trading routes have been stuffed up, and they've had to get very expensive oil from Venezuela, a friendly country, and to some degree Mexico. So that's made it very, very hard for them. And of course, whichever way the presidential election goes, the sanctions are probably going to be in place for some time.